Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mighty Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are reading Stars of Chaos Volume 5, and guess what? We are on the last two chapters before we reach the extras. Yay! So that's going to be chapters 127 and 128. I hope you all enjoy. Chapter 127, A New Emperor. When will the Hawks be ready? Chang'e asked, doing his best to master his mounting agitation. The commander who had accompanied him from the northern camp responded in a low voice. Patience, Your Highness. We're almost ready to fly. Don't call me that. It's not appropriate. Chang'e unhappily rejected the flattery without a second thought. Only after the words left his mouth did he notice his own restlessness. He sucked in a deep breath and dug his fingers into his sleeves, where a scrap of fabric was hidden. Whether it had been cut with a pair of shears or simply torn off, he had no notion, but its edge was ragged, as if it had been gnawed by a dog. This scrap had come tucked in a personal letter from Guyun, and at first, Chang'e couldn't fathom what it was. Guyun declared in his letter that it was a length of a belt he didn't need, the consequence of wasting away from a year's worth of yearning. Once he had been properly satisfied, he had written, he would ask Chang'e to sew it back on for him. In the same letter, he had mentioned that he had a secret personal wish, but as he had run out of paper, he would reveal it to Chang'e in his next letter. The late emperor left his imperial edict. The rest is just formality. Why be so rigid, Your Majesty? The commander diverted his train of thought, the picture of obedience as he delivered his flattery. The present commander of the northern camp was an eloquent and highly competent individual, the complete opposite of the departed Tan Hongfei. Noting the new emperor's expression, he added, Think of it this way. Marquis Gu has already cut the Westerners' supply lines. Even if they strike back now, our enemies are an arrow at the end of its flight. With the marshal himself on the front lines, what does His Majesty have to worry about? Chang'e said nothing. He knew the false news of the foreign affairs mission successfully completing their assassination attempt spread by Liu Zhong and the Lingyuan pavilion must have been approved by Guyun. The communication blockade that followed was also bait to lure the enemy into attacking. When Chang'e calmed down enough to think things over, it was obvious Guyun had used the nobles' attempted coup in the capital as the final element needed to wipe out the Westerners. His tactical brilliance was sufficient to be recorded in the annals of history. So indeed, what had Chang'e to worry about? Even the commander of the northern camp could grasp this. So how could Chang'e not? But for some reason, he felt desperately anxious. Or perhaps it wasn't anxiety at all, but rather that he simply missed Guyun so much. The soldiers inside the relay station hurried over to report that the Hawk armor was refueled, and they could be on their way. Chang'e had scarcely risen to his feet when 3 letters from the Liangjiang garrison arrived in rapid succession. None of these were meant to be posted to the capital. When fighting broke out along the front lines, orders were commonly sent to the surrounding military relay stations and local garrisons to prepare them to send reinforcements or raise their state of alert. The first letter said, Enemy attack. The second said, Major battle underway. And the third was a direct order for all troops to raise their combat readiness to the highest state of alert. The enemy has turned out in full force. We will meet them with maximum strength. All 3 letters were delivered before a single stick of incense had burned out. The commander of the northern camp felt his head was about to explode. Your Majesty, the front line is too dangerous. Please be patient and await news here. When the situation has stabilized, Chang'e was already on his feet. You're right. You should stay here. The commander gaped in shock. Everyone on the front lines was readying themselves on the eve of battle. No one expected their new emperor was just hours away, streaking toward the battlefield. Over a month had passed since Guyun was wounded at sea. In the aftermath of the capital siege, Guyun had gone from being dug out of a pile of corpses to donning his armor and returning to the northwestern front in about the same span of time. It had been but a few short years, yet that kind of rapid recovery was now merely the remembered heroics of a bygone youth. Guyun had drifted in and out of unconsciousness for over half a month and lost a dramatic amount of weight. Shun Yi would later say that during these handful of weeks, his breath was so weak he feared Gu Yun might pass at any time. Whatever it was that kept him hanging by a thread, he clung to it with all his might and miraculously pulled through. Yet, he still struggled to stand and spent half an age gathering his strength before he could take a single turn around the room. Because they didn't dare remove the steel panels affixed to his body, sitting for any length of time caused him excruciating pain. Pain had never been something Gu Yun feared. He was long accustomed to it and believed pain was the body's way of protecting itself, not necessarily a bad thing. But he had never experienced this kind of pain-induced exhaustion. It wasn't all bad news. On the bright side, his eyes seemed to be slowly recovering. Yao Jun had sent his men to ask among the locals until they found an old craftsman who constructed a custom-made glass monocle for Gu Yun. With its aid, Gu Yun could begin to make out objects within 3 meters and communicate a bit with others. The cut along his throat, too, was fairly shallow and had already healed over. It was just that his voice tended to grow hoarse when he spoke for too long. Unfortunately, he couldn't refrain from speaking. The Westerners were making their last stand. The enemy commander was that elderly pope who had on multiple occasions fought Gu Yun to a stalemate at sea. Although the waters had been muddied by a pack of indecisive Dongying folk attempting to play both sides, Great Liang's navy would have to gain a decisive advantage to obtain the shogunate's unequivocal support. Otherwise, it was impossible to guess whom Dongying would stab in the back. Ever since a Dongying agent had arrived, just as Gu Yun predicted, offering intelligence about the Westerners' plans, Gu Yun hadn't had a full night's sleep. Between his myriad concerns and the pain of his wounds, this latter, if he was being honest, was the primary reason. He lay awake until dawn more often than not. There had been no movement on the part of the soldiers outside, but he was so desperate to consider every possible situation that he had already fought several hundred skirmishes in the battleground of his mind. In preparation for this deadly endgame, Gu Yun had transformed the entire Black Hawk division from the northwest to the south. He Zhonghui and several other commanders, hoping to nurture the next generation, brought along young General Cai and a couple greenhorn officers to gain experience. With Shun Yi and Yao Jun helming the sea and He Zhonghui and true Blackhawks commanding the sky, the strongest soldiers of Great Liang, honed on years of war and chaos, had all been assembled on the battlefield in Jiangnan. This time, Gu Yun wasn't alone in the commander's tent. Little General Cai and a group of Black Iron Battalion veterans clustered inside as armored hawks came and went, addressing each new battle report with swift efficiency. Initially, the Westerners attempted to bombard them with heavy artillery, hoping to take advantage of the Liangjiang garrison's supposed internal strife to catch them off guard. Sure enough, the Liangjiang garrison scattered in faux panic and raised an iron boom to block their enemy's advance. In reality, this boom had been recently reinforced, and its new defensive capabilities were astonishing. A squadron of vanguard troops hidden behind the boom periodically fired off shots, allowing the Westerners to waste their ammunition returning fire. The Liangjiang forces quickly readied an ambush. Yao Jun had boarded a Sea Dragon warship, while Shun Yi and He Zhonghui were preparing to suit up and awaiting orders. It was like this, tucked between the rapid exchange of battlefield reports and orders, that news of the long-gone Emperor's passing arrived. The green and white-tagged emergency dispatch stood out like a sore thumb amid the flurry of concise battle reports. Presuming the mail canister contained some routine tidings from the imperial court, no one paid it any mind. Only once they had finished laying out their battle formations and the Westerners' cannon fire had died down did Xiao Cai diligently carry the canister into the commander's tent. Shun Yi was out, so Xiao Cai opened the canister for Gu Yun. "Sir, a green tag means urgent news from the court. But what does a white tag mean?" Gu Yun had been forcing himself to alertness all this time, but he was noticeably drained. Rubbing at his temples, he responded with an absent-minded, "What?" Noting Gu Yun's poor complexion, Xiao Cai didn't dare disturb him further. He hurried to help Gu Yun lie down and pulled a blanket over him. "Please get some rest, sir. I'll call you if anything comes up." With that, the young man quietly withdrew to the other side of the tent and opened the canister in silence, planning to skim its contents before setting it aside with the other correspondence that could be addressed after the battle. A single glance, however, stopped him cold. The young general was barely 20, and his experience was limited to riding recklessly as the head of the vanguard under his elderly father's command. He had never witnessed such a major political upheaval and was momentarily stunned. He Zhonghui was washing his face as he directed a nearby guard to prepare his armor. Spotting the boy's dumbstruck expression, he asked, "Xiao Cai, aren't you coming with me? Stop wool gathering and get ready. What are you dawdling for?" Young General Cai blinked hard. "Dage, this letter," he mumbled. "It says His Majesty's dead." Guyuan had developed an extreme sensitivity to the cold after his injury. Out of consideration for him, everyone worked together to ensure that the commander's tent was always warm. He Zhonghui naturally ran hot. He had no choice but to run to the door every now and again to splash cold water on his perspiring face. Upon hearing these words, he slowly straightened up from where he was bent over with his bum sticking out, his beard dripping water and his mouth agape. "What? His Majesty's dead." Xiao Cai licked his lips, dazed. After a moment's hesitation, he steeled himself and dropped to one knee beside Guyuan's bed. Sir," he called softly, tugging timidly at Guyuan's robe. "He won't hear you." He Zhonghui strolled forward, dragged Guyuan up out of bed, and shook him by the shoulders as he began to shout, his voice booming like a gong. "Marshal! Oi, Marshal! Wake up! It's dire news! The Emperor's kicked the damn bucket!" Young General Cai stood flabbergasted. Guyuan had hardly begun to doze when he was rattled back to wakefulness, eyes unfocused with sleep. He Zhonghui seemed to recall something. He turned back to Xiao Cai. "Wait, who's the Emperor now that he's dead? That tiny little brat?" He lifted his fan-sized hand waist-high, rudely marking the height of the little crown prince. "Before His Majesty departed his life, he passed the throne to His Highness Prince Yan." He Zhonghui was a crude man with a quick temper, but he was no idiot. He did a double take, then asked, baffled, "He passed the throne to Prince Yan instead of his own son? That makes no sense. Did he take the wrong medicine before he died or what?" Eyes flicking over the pair's lips as they spoke, Guyuan finally caught on to what they were yammering about and was scared into lucidity. "Give me that!" This unexpected revelation caused a momentary lull in orders. Puzzled by the silence from the command tent, Shunyi, fully decked out in battle regalia, and Cao Chunhua, presently disguised as Guyuan, were about to send someone to ask what was going on. Yet, to the surprise of all and before anyone could fully digest the news, the fabled new emperor arrived in the flesh. The garrison was in the middle of active battle and even more heavily guarded than usual. At first, the sentries couldn't believe their ears. It wasn't until the commander of the northern camp produced the emperor's tiger tally that one of them scrambled off to notify their superiors. Chang'e didn't wait. He charged straight in with his company of hawks in tow, but before he could reach the commander's tent, he ran into Cao Chunhua on his way to board a warship. Cao Chunhua was wearing an exact replica of Guyuan's face. Caught completely on the wrong foot, the two of them stared at each other in bewilderment for a frozen moment. It had been too long since Chang'e last saw Guyuan. His heart beat wildly, but before he could release his held breath, Guyuan seemed suddenly overcome with great fright, his eyes darting left and right in panic. With a sharp jerk of his horse's reins, he turned tail and bolted. Chang'e stared. He would have to be blind not to recognize who this was after that little performance. Chang'e was about to call out to stop him, but he bit the words back for fear of ruining some secret plan of Guyuan's. Instead, he galloped after the impostor, seized the steed's reins, and yanked both horse and rider to a halt. "Xiao Cao," he ground out between his teeth. Cao Chunhua wanted to cry. Clambering off his horse, he bowed his head and glanced meekly up at Chang'e, who looked like a moneylender come to collect. Cao Chunhua had yet to learn the earth-shattering news from the capital and sniffled mournfully. "Your Highness!" Chang'eng glared furiously back at him. I sent you here to take care of him, and here you are, doing his bidding and using all manner of lies to keep me in the dark. Cao Chunhua shamelessly twisted Gu Yuan's face into a mask of abject suffering. Chang'eng turned aside. Looking at this person made his stomach ache. He honestly had no idea how Cao Chunhua had managed to sneak behind enemy lines so many times without blowing his cover. Well, you know what they say. When the general is on the battlefield, he need not obey all of the emperor's orders, right? Cao Chunhua mumbled, taking his sweet time leading Chang'eng toward the commander's tent. Without the marshal's permission, I wouldn't have been able to send you updates even if I wanted to. Chang'eng huffed angrily, but let him off the hook at last. And what are you supposed to be, a decoy marshal? Frazzled, Cao Chunhua laughed awkwardly as he shot Shen Yi a speaking glance. Leaving Cao Chunhua to stall Chang'eng, Shen Yi dashed back to the commander's tent. It was as though they were running a distraction maneuver within their own garrison. One person held up the enemy while the other sprinted off to report to their superior. Cao Chunhua breathed a small sigh of relief as he watched Shen Yi turn on his heel and rush back to the commander's tent. But before the air could fully escape his lungs, he heard Chang'eng's chipped speech. What are you looking at? Cao Chunhua turned mute. Chang'eng shook off Cao Chunhua with growing suspicion. He had previously spent over a month in the Liangjiang garrison. A quick scan of the area yielded the location of the commander's tent and began striding over. Your Highness! Your Highness! Cao Chunhua grabbed at Chang'eng's sleeve in desperation as he gulped nervously. Your Highness, you must remain calm. Shen Yi burst in Gu Yuan's tent in a panic, looking as if the Western Pope's giant sea monster was nipping at his heels. Gu Ziqi! Jiping, my dear fellow, when did you acquire a stutter? He Zhonghui asked, bemused. Shen Yi didn't spare him a look. Launching himself to Gu Yuan's bedside, he wheezed. That little highness of yours is here. You... Everyone inside the tent was still hung up on the fact that Prince Yan had ascended the throne. They failed to grasp to whom this little highness referred. He Zhonghui and Xiao Cai stared at each other, confounded, as Gu Yuan slowly parsed what he had heard from Shen Yi's stumbling lips. Incredulous, he asked, Chang'eng? Shen Yi nodded, his face as distraught as the newly bereaved. Gu Yuan's face drained of color. If not for his physical weakness, he would have sprung from the bed. Feeling as though he had been caught in the act by his wife, he sputtered, Is there space under the bed for me to hide? Old He, out of the way! Move, move, move! He choked on his words, triggering a violent coughing fit. Before he could recover, a gentle spring breeze drifted in from the tent flap and brushed the back of the deaf-blind man's pale hand. Through his custom glass monocle, Gu Yuan vaguely made out a slender figure silhouetted in the doorway. Gu Yuan froze. Busted. The room was deathly silent. Gu Yuan was paralyzed by fear, while everyone else sat mouths agog at finding the new emperor mentioned in the emergency dispatch had appeared before their very eyes. Shen Yi, the only one without the slightest idea of what was going on, broke the silence. Don't look at me! I ran as fast as I could! He Zhonghui had met Prince Yan back when the prince escorted the supply caravan to the northwest. He was the first to snap to attention with a tentative, Your Majesty? As if waking from a dream, everyone sank to their knees in a kowtow, one after another. Chang'eng's eyes never strayed from Gu Yuan as he waved a stiff hand. When we last met, we were brothers. There's no need for all that, he said, barely maintaining his veneer of calm. Shen Yi's mind crowded with questions as he watched Chang'eng slowly make his way in, politely nodding in Shen Yi's direction before sailing past to stop before the bed. Chang'eng stared at Gu Yuan until his eyes began to sting like they were pricked by needles. Even so, he refused to look away. Gu Yuan's body was covered in steel panels, the bandages beneath his robe spotted with blood. A layer of fragile skin was stretched over his exposed collarbones and wrists, and his lips were bloodless. The custom glass monocle he wore consisted of multiple lenses layered on top of each other, the device so thick it obscured half his face. His one unobstructed eye stared blankly into the distance, unable to gather focus yet flickering with a subtle trace of nervousness. Under all those watching eyes, Chang'eng slowly sat down beside Guyun and tugged his blanket back into place. At the sight of the open mail canister, he turned to the commander of the northern camp, who had followed him all the way to the commander's tent. Take our tiger tally. Inform the soldiers of every division that their sovereign has arrived. This we declare. We will advance and retreat with our fellow soldiers and emerge victorious from this battle. A hush fell over the commander's tent. Then a voice rang out, "Long live the Emperor!" The cry raced from the commander's tent through the entire garrison as if on spread wings. For the first time in centuries, both tiger tallies appeared in the same place, hanging from a battle flag whipping in the wind like a powerful grounding force, unshakable by tidal waves or cannon fire. Although the new emperor was yet uncrowned, the fealty of the military generals throughout the realm was already his. The thunder of artillery fire erupted once more as the Westerners resumed their assault on the iron boom. Guyuan dared not tarry a moment longer. His officers filed out, off to carry out their new orders. Guyuan's messenger tactfully withdrew as well, leaving only Guyuan and Chang'eng in the commander's tent. The instant they were alone, while Guyuan was still searching for the right words, Chang'eng swayed on his feet. He felt as though someone had torn out his spine. He struggled to stand as his chest heaved like he was in excruciating pain, panting for breath. His hand came up to clutch at his heart, and his jaw clenched as his shoulders curled, back wound tight enough to snap. Scared out of his wits, Guyuan hastily reached out to press careful fingers to his back. "Chang'eng, what's wrong?" Chang'eng grabbed his hand in a panic, clutching it as though he was clinging to his last hope. He was gasping so hard he couldn't even speak, the veins at his temples bulging from the strain. In all the years Guyuan had looked after him, Chang'eng had never shown any signs of a malady of the heart. Guyuan immediately called out, "Where are the medics? Guards!" One of the guards outside poked his head back into the commander's tent. "Get out! Don't come in!" Chang'eng squeezed the words from his throat. The bewildered guard didn't dare defy imperial orders and hastily ducked back outside. Guyuan looked at Chang'eng, at a loss for what to do. Chang'eng's eyes were bloodshot and seemed on the verge of twinning, yet the shadow of the second pupil was stuck to the first, as though strung together on a thread. Marshal Gu braced himself as Chang'eng slowly turned toward him, prepared to weather another one of his flare-ups. But after a turn or more, Chang'eng said only with deadly calm, "If I had come any later, would I have ever seen you again?" Guyuan had no way to respond. "All this time, I've been off in the capital listening to nobles squabble while happily awaiting the day of your return, so I could finally show you the completed steam railway, so I could talk to you and sew that stupid belt of yours back on. But what about you?" Chang'eng asked, his voice soft as he slowly tightened his grip on Guyuan's hand and pulled it toward his chest. He gazed down at Guyuan's sickly pale fingers. "Tell me, would that day ever come?" It was as though a steel nail had punched a hole in through Guyuan's heart, and for a moment he found himself completely bereft of words. "I hate you," Chang'eng said. "I hate you to death, Gutsushi." These words had weighed heavy on his heart alongside his nightmarish Wuarga attacks ever since Guyuan left him behind in the Marquis estate to sneak off to the northwest all those years ago. But now, after enduring torturous treatment that had reduced the influence of the Wuarga by half, he could no longer suppress them. Finally, he spoke them aloud. Chang'eng broke down as, for a brief moment, he deviated from the path he had chosen for himself in his childhood of shedding only blood and not tears. His Majesty, Great Liang's new emperor, who had minutes ago delivered a resounding speech before his generals, dissolved into bitter tears in the commander's tent. Chapter 128. Finale. An end and a beginning. Guyuan wanted to reach out and embrace Chang'eng, But after two failed attempts to tug him closer, he simply sat beside him in silence, not daring to make a sound as Chang'eng sobbed out the many grievances he had held back for over a decade all at once. But the new emperor was a luckless man. Before he could satisfy himself crying his fill, a blast of cannon fire rocked the commander's tent, followed by the screech of steel wings slicing through the air. Chang'eng had barely drawn back from the bed when an armored hawk burst in. "Sir, the boom's been breached. The Westerners have come into range." Guyuan's fingertips were stained with Chang'eng's tears. He curled them into a fist and nodded. "Understood. Follow the plan and pin them down." The hawk messenger's feet touched the ground for scant moments before he was taking off again. Chang'eng turned back to look at Guyuan. Tear tracks still marred his cheeks. He was the picture of wounded distress. Utterly defenseless against such a face, Guyuan immediately capitulated. "Chang'eng, come here," he said softly. "Let me dry your tears." "What happened about that honey tongue of yours?" Chang'eng asked, his voice choked with sobs. Sighing, Guyuan obediently lowered his voice to a deep murmur. "Darling, come, let me lick your tears clean." For a moment, Chang'eng could barely speak for anger. While Chang'eng sputtered, Guyuan grabbed hold of the edge of the bed and dragged himself up. He could barely stand upright, and when he stood, the steel panels encasing his legs clanged against the side of the bed. The tendons in his neck stood out beneath his bandages with the effort, and his unbound hair spilled over his shoulders, dark strands twisting through the chain of his glass monocle. "What are you doing? Stop that!" Chang'eng snapped. As he strode forward to push Guyuan down onto the bed, Guyuan seized the opportunity to pull him into his arms. Guyuan's temples were sheened with sweat, his breathing quick and shallow. The weight of his body sagged against Chang'eng, the cumbersome steel plates affixed to his body an aggravating barrier between them. Eyes lightly closed, he sucked in a breath and stroked fingers over Chang'eng's tense back. "Beat me or yell at me, whatever you like, but let me hold you a while first, okay? I've missed you so much." Chang'eng had finally managed to compose himself, yet now his eyes began to sting again. He clung desperately to Guyuan's waist and felt that his excess length of belt was much more than the small section that had been torn off. Whatever he wanted to say was drowned out by the frenzied roar of artillery fire. Guyuan turned slightly and pressed a kiss to Chang'eng's cheek. Incredibly, he was as good as his word, trailing his lips along the tracks left by Chang'eng's tears until he reached Chang'eng's mouth, tasting faintly of salt. Chang'eng's lips trembled, whether in pain, anger, or anticipation, neither knew, all throughout. Guyuan paused for a heartbeat, then leaned in and licked at the seam of Chang'eng's mouth. Chang'eng tightened his grip on Guyuan's waist, but before he could get a proper taste, the screech of yet another armored hawk split the air, so loud it was audible even to the deaf. Chang'eng was speechless. There really was no end to it. All of Great Liang's up-and-coming commanding officers and elite soldiers were gathered here on the front lines in this battle. Did these bastards really have to run back to the commander's tent to request new orders at every fresh development? In the heat of the moment, His Majesty didn't stop to think that perhaps he oughtn't drag Great Liang's commander-in-chief off for a lover's tryst amid crashing artillery fire. A Black Hawk flung open the tent flap. "Sir, the Western ships have caught on. They're in retreat. General Shun managed to corner the enemy's flagship out of our cuttlefish. General He asks when the Black Hawk's main force can move out." Guyuan swiped a thumb over the corner of his mouth. "We wait until the enemy flagship makes its final play." The Black Hawk saluted before turning to roar away, leaving Guyuan and Chang'eng to look at each other awkwardly. Chang'eng had yet to quiet his racing heart. Helpless, he smiled weakly as he half-carried Guyuan back to the bed. After pulling Guyuan's blankets back in place, he retrieved the ragged length of fabric Guyuan had sent him from his lapels and fished a needle and thread from his sachet. The thread was the precise blue-green of the fabric. He had obviously come prepared. Tugging Guyuan's belt over, Chang'eng turned it around to inspect it. Sure enough, someone had carelessly torn off one end, leaving behind a mess of fraying threads. Does the marshal walk around in these rags every day? Changung asked, exasperated. Eyes narrowed, Guyuan read his lips, then laughed softly. No, I just happened to put on these robes. Perhaps our hearts connected in our dreams. I had an inkling your majesty would personally come repair my belt today. The needle stilled. Before Changung could glance up at Guyuan's expression, a hand landed on his face. Guyuan stroked his fingers up along Changung's jaw toward the base of his ear. Aren't you tired? Changung blinked rapidly. Perhaps the pain just now had been too intense. He felt a dam within him was about to break. Guyuan had spoken 3 scant words, yet Changung's eyes were filling with tears. He asked in response, Doesn't it hurt? He thought Guyuan would remain silent, but to his surprise, after a few beats, Guyuan answered honestly, It hurts so much I can hardly sleep. Changung's hands trembled, as though pricked by a needle. But it doesn't hurt as much as seeing you cry, Guyuan went on. Don't cry anymore, or your Yifu will have nightmares for the rest of his life. As far back as childhood, Changung had never been able to discern when Guyuan was being glib and when he was sincerely trying to comfort him. He could only treat all of Guyuan's words as if they were spoken in earnest, and now his heart softened. Most of the Wu'erge has been purged, right? Miss Chun has taken good care of you. This battle is as good as won. The enemy has held nothing back. They've charged straight into our ambush. The second they're within range, a large shoal of cuttlefish is waiting to swarm their flagship. That monster of theirs has a fatal flaw. Its response time is too slow in an emergency. When the Western Pope is pushed to his limit, he'll inevitably... An earth-shattering rumble cut him off. Guyuan couldn't hear it, but he could feel the bed shaking. Smiling serenely, he waited a full quarter hour until the tremors gradually subsided before picking up where he left off. He'll bring out all the heavy artillery beneath his flagship shell and try to brute force his way through. The Western flagship is stuffed with violet gold and gunpowder, yet it has never revealed its true capabilities on the battlefield. We've considered it, and we believe there are 2 reasons for this. First, it can't afford to consume so much fuel. Second, the moment the flagship enters the fray itself, it can no longer issue instructions to the Sea Dragon fleet under its... A Black Hawk dove down to make a 3rd battle report. Sir, there's something wrong with the Western flagship. Just now, General Shun took advantage of the chaos to outflank it and sank nearly half their fleet. The Black Hawks are preparing to pursue. He fell silent as the scream of Black Hawks reached their ears. The sound of a flock of aerial assassins, tens of thousands strong, beating their black wings against the wind. Your Majesty, Guyuan turned to Changung, would you like to see how our army recovers Jiangnan? Guyuan looked nothing like a wounded soldier confined to his sickbed when he spoke about the battle. His manner was that of the great general who once infiltrated Prince Wei's rebel army, who had crushed the southwestern bandits, who had pacified the northwest, and who would now retake Jiangnan as methodically as laying stones on a Weiqi board. Changgung's expression was solemn. My general's word is worth more than gold. He is invincible in battle. Among the aircraft stationed in the Liangjiang garrison was a fortified red-headed kite. Changung helped Guyuan out of the commander's tent and aboard, and the vessel slowly rose into the air over the garrison. The entire battlefield, from the iron ships crossing the blue-green sea-like flood dragons to the billowing smoke rising in all directions, was visible through a field scope from their high vantage. The Western Navy dragged out their final struggle for over 4 hours before finally running out of steam. The damaged enemy flagship gathered up the scattered remains of their fleet and fled toward Dongying in a limping retreat. Refusing to release their prey, Great Liang's navy gave chase, once and for all putting to rest the idea that they were incapable of fighting on the open seas. The chase continued into the night, brazenly encroaching on Dongying coastal waters. Guyuan, who had managed to endure the pain of his injuries to watch the entire battle, began to smile. Dongying would become the far westerners' burial ground. As the Western Navy fled, they sent 4 dispatches in rapid succession requesting military support from Dongying. But like stones cast into the sea, all four were met with silence. Instead, as the relentless Great Liang Navy pursued them into Dongying waters, the Westerners were stunned to find a fleet of steely Dongying Sea Dragon warships, their own gift to these Wokou pirates at the start of the war, blocking their way. The two fleets closed in on each other. A Western signalman waved his flag so frantically he nearly fell overboard, only for their erstwhile ally to respond with a harsh string of syllables and an unmistakable message. As one, the Dongying battleships turned their cannon muzzles on the ships of their former comrades and fired. A blood-red sunset spilled across the sea, as if closing the final curtain on these years of war. Guyuan chuckled softly at the sight of the explosions far out across the surface of the water. He had seen the battle to its end and was truly drained, so exhausted he knew he'd fall asleep the moment his head hit his pillow. Yet Chang'e suddenly leaned over to grasp his chin and tilted his face toward his own. "You said in your last letter that you had a secret personal wish, but that you'd run out of space. What was it?" Guyuan began to laugh. "What was it?" Chang'e pressed. Guyuan tugged him closer and murmured into his ear, "I wish to spend the rest of my life growing old with you." Oh my God. Guyuan, you can't just... Okay, sorry. Chang'e drew in a sharp breath. After a moment to gather himself, he finally said, "You're the one who said it. A great general's word is worth more than gold. And lo, I am invincible in battle," Guyuan finished. In the 10th year of Longan, on the 4th day of the 3rd month, after an entire day and night of battle and the betrayal of their Dongying allies, the Western Navy that had occupied the East Sea for years suffered total defeat at the hands of Great Liang's young navy. The new emperor, having judged Guyuan's mission successfully completed, dragged the marshal back to the capital to recuperate. A fortnight later, the railway officially opened for service. With this major lifeline connecting northern and southern Great Liang, large quantities of engines, armor, and violet gold could be transported south at a moment's notice, allowing the Liangjiang garrison to quickly commission several naval bases for amphibious aircraft. Meanwhile, under Shen Yi's command, ground forces scoured Great Liang's southern territories, expelling the remaining western occupiers. Cut off from their powerful navy and ground support, the western soldiers garrisoned in Jiangnan were blown away like fallen leaves by the autumn wind, their fragile vanguard crumbling at the first blow. The cleanup lasted 2 short months. By the 5th month of the year, the Western Army was formally tendering their surrender to the throne. A large group of prisoners of war were captured and detained within Great Liang, including the Pope himself. The Holy Empire had no choice but to gather up what little dignity they had left and send an envoy to negotiate. The peace terms saw the Westerners handing over cold, hard cash in exchange for their prisoners. As for the old and ailing Pope, he reportedly died en route to his homeland. Whether his death was natural or the work of his own countrymen, no one knew. It didn't matter anymore. After so many years, the storm cloud looming over the southern half of the nation dispersed at last, and the sweet fragrance of osmanthus drifted over the plains of Jiangnan in the autumn once more. Li Min, the former Prince Yan, formally ascended the throne. The nation adopted his era name, Tai Shi, Grand Beginning, the following year. In the early days of his reign, the new emperor issued an imperial edict decreeing that the children of the late emperor may remain in the palace. The little crown prince, he declared, would remain the apparent heir. Rather than consolidate military power, he left Guyuan's black iron tiger tally in the marshal's hands and further granted Guyuan authority to oversee the nation's military from the capital and deploy forces to the 4 borders as he saw fit. Guyuan's first act was to break up the 3 divisions of the Black Iron Battalion and resign them to various garrisons throughout the nation. The group of valiant soldiers that had grown up in the smoke of war thus carried forward the will of their ancestors, taking up the defense of the nation on all sides. During his 18 years in power, the Taisho emperor, who had always regarded himself as emperor regent, issued a series of laws restricting the powers of everyone from himself as the head of state, down to the various civil and military officials of the court, and even the common people. It was a fair and impartial code that defined an individual's personal rights and responsibilities while allowing for regular reflection on one's shortcomings. His large-scale reforms slowly pushed aside the miasma of injustice and corruption that had blanketed the land for millennia. The end of one era would always herald the beginning of another. Oh, you guys. Oh my God. We reached the end of the official story. These last two chapters were very, very good. I have to say, if there were no extras, I actually would be satisfied with this ending. I think, yeah, maybe like a small part of me would be like, yeah, what happens afterward? But I actually just like the way that ended. And I love the way Priest wrote it, actually, with, the title of the chapter being an end and a beginning, and her ending the chapter with the end of one era would always herald the beginning of another, because that is true. Whether, no matter how you put it, the end of one chapter is the beginning of another, the end of one book is the beginning of another, and so on and so forth. I just thought that was a beautiful and perfect end. Nevertheless, we do have extras, so we will be digging into those. Yay! But let's go ahead and go back to the previous page, 197, when Guyun said his wish was to spend the rest of his life growing old with Chang'e. Oh, I loved that so much. I love that because I remember a time when Guyun didn't really share his thoughts and feelings like that. And he still has that struggle, which is obvious because Chang'e had no idea what was going on. And, he was concerned, like, would I have even seen you again if I ain't come here, bruh? But for him to be that open and earnest, and even the pages before, when he was like, please don't cry, you're going to give me nightmares. I believe he was being genuine then too. But it was just so beautiful. And oh my gosh, if this was like a play or a movie, oh, that was the perfect scene ending when he was like, I wish to spend the rest of my life growing old with you. And then, he was like, well, you said it. A great general's word is worth more than gold. And then Guyun was like, and lo, I am invincible in battle. For him to repeat the words of Chang'e like that, swear, that would be such a dope end scene. I don't know. Does anyone else feel that way? Okay. Anyway, the other thing that I want to comment on is Chang'e's breakdown. I actually don't have like a whole lot to say about it, but just the sheer fact that it happened, my heart broke, and I felt for him so much because, he's been facing so many things in the court, in the capital, and just waiting for the day that he could see Guyun again. Meanwhile, Guyun has basically had reports sent and, telling people like, don't share this news, only share this select news, the good stuff, so that nothing bad about me gets back to Chang'e. And like, I get it. I get why he would do that, especially with Chang'e having Ge, even though, Chen Qingxu was working on that, yada, yada, yada. But it's like, as a couple, when you know that your significant other is hiding their woes from you because they don't want to burden you, that in itself is very hurtful, because it's like, I want to share that burden with you. You may be thinking you don't want to burden me, but I don't want you to hold that burden by yourself. And yet you made me do that. You made me ignorant to what was really going on. Now, I just happen to be smart enough to know that you're hiding stuff from me. So I just, came out of the woodwork and showed up there on the battlefield in your commander's tent. But, he left him ignorant. And if Guyun were to die, that just would have hurt even more. Knowing that your significant other died and they didn't even tell you the severity of what was really going on. And then they were just gone. while you, in the meantime, are waiting for them to come back. So I totally feel him. And I do remember him thinking, I hate you when he was younger, when he was a teen or whatever. So for that to like come back up and for him to finally say it, I feel it. I totally feel it. And I did the exact same thing a couple years ago, concerning like my mother. I was like by myself one day and some things were going on. And right in that moment, she wasn't even there, but I was like, I hate you to myself, like Changung. But it wasn't until like I told her, well, I didn't tell her I hate her. I told her that I had the experience. I was like, yeah, in that moment, I was like, I hate you. And that made me realize I needed therapy. But that it hurt. But there is so much relief, I know, whether he realizes it or not, that Changung was able to get to finally release all those feelings that he's had over the years. So I'm happy for him from that respect. But God, oh my God, Guyun, why you have to make him hurt like that? Anyway, this was really good. This was really good, you guys. So now we are officially going to the extras, and I cannot be more happy. I cannot. And of course, we're just a little bit over halfway done with the book because there are 390 something pages. Yeah, 391. And then I think I'm also going to read the afterword for you guys because it's really short, but we'll get there when we get there. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed these 2 chapters. Please comment on this one. I want to read you guys' comments and comment back so bad. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Wa Einiman.